It's a pleasure to be with all of you all this morning. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce the panel that needs no introduction. But I want to start out doing something they tell you should never do in law school, which is ask a question that you don't know the answer to. So this is a question for you all. How many of you have ever done something complex, big, important, and you went alone? You did it by yourself without anyone, any group that brought a different perspective to what you're doing. So a few hands. How'd that go? and I asked that question because for so long, particularly as we have dealt with big, challenging social issues, sectors have struck out on their own. And certainly there's been a narrative, the government needs to fix this, or churches can do this, or the private sector can do this. When in fact we have found that logically complex problems need often complex solutions, and that requires thinking and work across sectors. So the opposite of the way that we have approached many of our big problems for far, far too long. And when I was in the White House, I guess it was about 2010 or so, President Obama was thinking through this issue and asked us in the Domestic Policy Council to consider the communities that were taking on big, complex challenges and to identify the reason why certain communities were doing this well and certain communities were being less successful. And we created a council for community solutions. They looked all over the country, and we're talking about 26 people from the business sector, from philanthropy, from the nonprofit sector, and so on. And they identified about 10 or 12 communities that were doing this particularly well and started to look at the reasons why they were doing it so well. At about the same time, Mark and John had written the article that Steve mentioned that so many of you have not only read but forwarded in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And it validated what the council was starting to identify in terms of the reasons why certain communities were successful. And it also led us to believe that we were on our way to doing something from the White House and figuring out how the government could be a successful partner in this collaborative work. And from that, as Steve said, the article went viral, and there was a movement that started around this approach called collective impact. And the next thing I'm going to do after I introduce the panel is to ask Mark to set this up for us, particularly for those of you who may not have read the article or it's been a while since you read the article, and that'll ground the conversation that we'll have this morning. And then, of course, we'll provide some opportunity for you all to ask questions of the panel as well. But as I said, this panel needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it very briefly anyway. You can read more about their bios online. And I'll start with David Brooks, who is a colleague at the Aspen Institute. In our conversation, I'm sure he'll talk about his program here at Aspen called Weave. He provides, and I'll speak for myself, many of us sanity when you watch the news hour every evening. That's where my husband and I get so much of our news, but also writes for the New York Times and for other publications. So we're appreciative that David, who has been writing about collective impact, can be here with us this morning. Next to David is my colleague Monique Miles, who's the director of the Opportunity Youth Forum, and she will describe more of that work and the use of collective impact on the ground and what that has meant as we've been working in urban, rural, and tribal communities. And she's also the deputy director of the Forum for Community Solutions. And then next to me is Mark Kramer, who Steve has already provided some introduction. Mark is the co-founder and managing director of FSG, also writes for numerous periodicals, and helped give birth to collective impact. So I'm going to start with you, Mark, and ask you both to set up collective impact for us, and also let us know why you think this article did go viral.
Well, thanks, and good morning, and thank you for getting up early to be here. We started FSG thinking about doing strategy consulting for funders, how to help them have greater social impact. And we were really thinking about how do you find individual organizations to fund that solve problems. And we were working for a funder in Cincinnati, Ohio, who wanted to fund an education. And we go around and interview people who are working in the field. Everybody we talked to in Cincinnati said, if you want to do something in education, you have to be part of this group Strive. Now, we've never heard everyone in a city working on an issue come up with the same answer. So we got very curious about it, and we began to study what they were doing. And we learned that they had brought together 300 different organizations, from government agencies, churches, school officials, nonprofits working on education, families, all different sectors, and gotten them to develop a common agenda, a shared measurement system, so that everybody was measuring progress on educational achievement throughout the city in the same way. They were beginning to evolve mutually reinforcing activities as opposed to each one doing their own thing. They had continuous communication. The heads of all these organizations met together in different working groups every few weeks, and they'd been doing this for years. And above all, there was a group that was providing what we called a backbone function. They were helping to hold this convening together. They were helping to gather the data and the measurement results and ensure that people paid attention to them. They were building public will. They were working on policy, all kinds of critical things. You know, I'm sure everybody here has been part of some kind of collaborative effort. And I'm sure you all understand the definition that collaboration is an unnatural act by non-consenting adults. And so the question is, how do you keep it going? And it turns out having this small group of people who play this backbone function is really essential to keep it going. But as we studied this and as we wrote the article and began to do some of this work, we realized there's a much bigger issue here. That all of the problems, social and environmental problems that we think about in our society and in our world, are not there by accident. They are the outcome of the behavior of a set of disorganized systems. You know, we talk about a healthcare system, we talk about an education system, talk about a criminal justice system. None of these are coherent, organized, structured systems. They are all a collection of individual actors, each doing what makes sense to them, but with no idea how what they're doing and the choices they make affect other players. And of course, every social and environmental problem is affected not just by nonprofits and not just by funders, but by government and by business. And yet, we never bring these players together to develop a common agenda to work toward some common outcome. So what we began to see is that collective impact is actually a mechanism for changing systems and for enabling all of the players in a system to come together, to learn from each other, to build trust, which is a huge element of what's needed, and to begin to find solutions that actually change the system and change outcomes. And after about 30 years of working in the social sector, I can say the only times, almost the only times, I have seen real change at significant scale in a whole region on an issue has been when I've seen collective impact. And so we've worked on projects like the juvenile justice system in the state of Connecticut and found in 3 years a 45% reduction in the number of youth in custody. We've worked on opioid addiction in Staten Island, and again, within 3 years, found a 30% reduction in opioid use. And we actually had an outside evaluation group come in and study about 25 different collective impact efforts, and they found real progress in about 20 of them, and they did deep dives in about 8 of those, and found that collective impact, this model, really was essential in delivering population-level change on these complex social issues. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, it sounds like a simple model. There are these 5 elements. It's really hard. It doesn't always work. It's not a simple formulaic approach that can automatically be applied like a cookie cutter. It has to be adapted to each community, to each issue. It's deeply affected by the actual personalities of the people involved in leading it in a given community. I'll also say there are two other elements that we didn't know about when we wrote the article that we've discovered are tremendously important as we've done this work in the years since then. The first is to pay attention to racial equity. Every issue performs very differently when you begin to think about it in terms of race. And we've found that collective impact efforts need to put equity at the center, to disaggregate all the data by race, and to be constantly aware of how the efforts that they're putting into place are affected by racial dynamics. The other thing we found that we didn't say in the article is that it's tremendously important to engage members of the community, people with lived experience of the problem you're trying to solve. They understand it in a way that others do not. And yet you can't just take a youth who's been in the juvenile justice system and put him in a room with the mayor and the heads of a major corporation and the head of a foundation and expect that what he or she says is going to be candid and is going to be listened to. And so it actually takes quite a bit of creativity and intention to figure out how to get the voices of those impacted by the problem into the conversation in a way that has power and credibility. So I'll stop there.
Great, and thank you, Mark. And you've set this up perfectly without even our planning it. I want to turn to Monique and then to David. You said this is really hard. Yeah. And Monique, I want to pick up on that point with you because you have led and directed work for the last 4+ years, working in communities as diverse as Greenville, Mississippi, Hopi, Arizona, LA, New York, Philadelphia, the list goes on and on. And could you talk some about what this looks like on the ground, given the framework that Mark just described?
Absolutely, and I hope it's okay if I just take 1 minute to further contextualize this work, just so you have a sense when I begin to talk about the complexity of it, what is really going on fundamentally as we partner with communities to improve outcomes for young people. So as Steve noted, I lead the Opportunity Youth Forum, which supports 27 communities, again, rural, urban, and tribal communities across the country to improve education and career outcomes for young people who are out of school and out of work. Nationally, that number of young people is 4.6 million. And when we started this work several years ago, that number was 5.8 million. So when we talk about cross-system and cross-sector collaboratives, there's been this national work and local work that has really worked to begin to move the needle on getting to better outcomes. So these communities are working across systems and across sectors to improve education and career outcomes. And as Mark mentioned, they're working with partners like the K-12 system, the post-secondary system, but also the justice system and the foster care system. And then for us, as we've thought about this work, it's been really important, particularly to this point around equity and community engagement, to have young people, the people who are most impacted by the issues, at the center of problem identification and solution design. But I'll come back to that in a minute. What's really important to note is that we have this national network that we have invested more than 15 million in to support these outcomes. We convene this national network twice a year. So in the spring, we go into place. We pick a community within our network and we bring our entire national network, 350 plus different types of community-based leaders, system leaders, and young youth community organizers into place, and we look at that local ecosystem. So to pick up on Mark's point around context, we get into that local context and ecosystem so that together as a learning network, we can explore a range of different types of solutions and strategies that are moving the needle. And then in the fall, we bring our network here to Aspen. And what's really important about that is that in the fall, we really are focused on how we built the movement. That's where we begin to look at how our local efforts really aggregate into the national level, at the national level, and how together we are able to really begin to look at gaps in terms of the progress we're making and really organize nationally in terms of what our national agenda needs to be to get to better outcomes. So we're working to achieve metric impact and system change. So that's a little bit about our learning network. And the two pieces that I would say that also I think speaks to the complexity, what's so hard, and to pick up on what Mark said, is that that. So context matters, right? This is a core value that we hold in this work. So while we have some notion of what levers really get to impact on the ground in place and sometimes really accelerate system change, we know, for example, that you have to do the collaboration. We know that data has to guide your strategy. We know that system change has to be the strategy that you have in place. We know that you have to have philanthropic support. You have to have public dollars. We also know that you have to have an advocacy strategy to really build the public will and be able to move an agenda. But again, because we have Hopi in our network and we have New York City in our network, it's so important then to think about the context and how the strategy looks really different in place, and as we're bringing communities together, how we are differentiating learning to be able to support that. So picking up on what that means as it relates to equity. We also believe, as Mark was talking about how complex our systems are, that when we start talking about who opportunity youth are, we define them as young people between the ages of 16 to 24 who are out of school and out of work, and who are disproportionately African American and Latino students, young people. We know that when we start talking about the systems that impact their lives, the systems that have locked them opportunity, that there's not only historic policies and historic disinvestment that have led to these outcomes, but particularly to Mark's point, we also know that race has played a role in terms of locking young people out of opportunity, in terms of the way that systems are performing. So for us, embracing an equity lens is key then to supporting our communities to do this collective, collaborative problem solving. Two things on that. We spend a lot of time as a national network working with leaders like John Powell at the Haas Institute in Berkeley. One of the strategies that John teaches us that we support our community grantee partners to implement is a strategy called targeted universalism. So to get at this complexity, targeted universalism tells us that it's really important to set a universal goal. So for example, a typical collective impact approach might say, we know that young students need to be reading at a third grade reading level in order to complete a elementary school credential. So that is the universal goal that the community has set. At the same time, we have to target our strategies so that we can begin to look at the different populations within that third grade, so that as we're allocating resources, as we're making decisions about curriculum, about teaching, about learning, we can really target our approach to meet the unique needs of different populations within that group. So we really embrace that across our network because we're talking about justice-involved youth, we're talking about foster system-involved youth, we're talking about teenage parents, homeless youth, et cetera. So when we think about equity, that frame around target universalism matters. The second piece that I would say, and this also comes from John Powell's practice, is moving beyond inclusion to belonging. And this is really important, right? Because there's lots of national dialogue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But John helps us think across our national network around what does it mean to move from inclusivity to belonging? And his answer essentially is that when you are including people, when you invite people to the table, that's important, right? They sit at the table, they have a place at the table. When you move from inclusivity to belonging, you are talking about co-creating a table. So for us, in terms of our work, as we have thought about co-creating a table, again, I talked about young people being at the center of problem identification and solution design. That is how we think about equity, and critically, it's also how we think about the community engagement piece. It helps us get to the really contextualized solutions. It helps to design strategies that really are informed by the lived experiences of the young people who have been impacted by these challenges. It helps the community to hold the strategy so that as we think about long-term impact, that sustainability is baked in to the equity and community engagement approach that our communities are using.
Thanks, Monique. David, I want to bring you into the conversation, picking up on what Monique and Mark have talked about, and probably what I imagine your life must look like as a writer and as a public intellectual. I mean, there's so much incoming, so much that you're observing, that you're seeing both nationally and internationally. And this sparked your interest. The issue of collective impact sparked your interest. What's happening in communities sparked your interest. And I'm curious if you can tell us what first piqued your interest in this, and why did you decide to delve more deeply into it and to start writing about it?
I'd written 73 columns on why Donald Trump was a bad guy, and I got tired of that. That's basically. No, I got involved in Aspen Institute through this project we call Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And the basic theory of Weave is that there's a social continuum. Some people live pretty isolated lives. They don't know their neighbors. They're distrustful of outsiders. They don't have warm, rich emotional commitments to each other, to people around them. Some people have extremely rich emotional lives. They know their neighbors. They serve their community. They have a sense of spiritual and moral fulfillment because they're so enmeshed in loving relationships. And the theory is we should all move a little over on that continuum. Mm-hmm. No matter where you start, we should all move a little over. And we try to find ways where you can move over, I can move over. And we do it by holding up exemplars, who are really living rich relationships. And we do it by giving practical advice, how to build those relationships, and then creating contacts where that can happen. And so we spent a year traveling around the country finding people we call weavers, who are just amazing community builders. And in the course of that travels, two things occurred to me. The first is that the neighborhood is the unit of change. We all have that starfish story in our mental files. I saved that one. But a friend of mine in Shreveport, Louisiana says, you can't only clean the part of the pool you're swimming in. We're so contagious, behavior is so contagious, you have to change the whole system. And I don't know who saw Raj Chetty yesterday, but Raj gave example after example of how important neighborhood is. And like, I live on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and on Halloween, my block is not a good block. But there are a couple blocks over that are great blocks. And why is that? Because there are a couple of magnetic families on those blocks who create rich culture, and everybody knows we're going to go to those blocks for Halloween. And that happens for economic development as well. Some towns are magnetic, and some because they have deep connection, and some are not. So neighborhood is a unit of change. The second thing I learned is that you got to treat the whole person. Life is longitudinal. We go into so many communities, and there's one program with one donor, with one randomized controlled experiment, and they're trying to do one program that'll turn around a life. That's not how our lives are. Mm-hmm. When I think of my background, well, I had a family, went to a summer camp, I went to a school, I had all these institutions which put me together. And so those were two things I came across. Life is longitudinal, the neighborhood is a unit of change. Then I walk into this room in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and there's charts all over the walls with all this data about kid performance. And then I sit around the table, and it's the weirdest congregation of people you could imagine. It's like the newspaper editor's there, some church leaders are there, some school superintendents are there, the Chamber of Commerce is there, the former mayor is there. It's just a weird collection of people. It's everybody who could touch a child. Mm-hmm. And so they're all there working together. And then I learned, a truth from Cincinnati, that we are program rich but systems poor. And so here I saw a system that was doing that. And so it just seemed like this was answering all the wrong ways to think about how to do social change. Mm-hmm. And the one challenge I put, and I think you referred to it briefly, when I went around that room in South Carolina, it was the town fathers and mothers. It was the very prominent citizens of the town. And I think social impact now, my perception is it's struggling to reach everybody in the town. But it started out with a little of the local fathers and mothers.
Yeah, and just to build on that 1 second, I think that's right. And I think part of the power we've seen is if you get the leaders of organizations, the CEOs together, when they see an opportunity to do something different, they can make it happen in a way that if you get people at mid-level or lower level, they have to fight within the system to make the change. So part of what we've seen is so important about collective impact is it can bring those with the power to make change together with those who understand and live the issue. Right. And they can develop together a common understanding of that issue.
So can I just name one thing in that? Yeah, because I feel like that really what's implicit in what Mark just talked about is community power building. And you are bringing together people who have traditionally held power in place and have made decisions that have impacted the lives of groups that have traditionally been marginalized and not had a seat at the table. And so as you're thinking about the complexity of this work, and I would say particularly for us supporting communities in place, that community power building and looking at how you think about redesigning structures and trying to set a table so that people have a voice, people have agency, so that the people who have, again, been most impacted by these issues are able to speak up and be heard. And most critically, as Mark said earlier, their voice actually influences the strategy so that they really feel like they have a stake in what's happened in their community. It really requires the people who have traditionally had those roles to do a lot of actually what Darren Walker talked about at the opening of Ideas Festival, being very uncomfortable, really doing that internal examination of their systems, of their practices, of their policies, so that as they're thinking about what does it mean to actually do this work in a meaningful and sustainable way, there is that not just self-organization, but that organization and institutional self-examination that's necessary and uncomfortable, but critical to be able to actually do the community building work and that power building work for people in place that gets to a shared agenda that is collectively owned by the people.
And I want to talk about something you all, I think Mark, you used the word trust. David, you talked about swimming outside your pool. And Monique, you've just talked about discomfort and bringing these groups that often have nothing to do with one another together to come up with a shared agenda and shared goals. I mean, think about it. You don't trust someone and all of a sudden we're going to have something that's shared and we're going to work toward it. Talk about how important that is and what that looks like on the ground, because trust and respect in many regards sound like ephemeral things, but in many ways it's the mortar that holds a lot of this together.
Yeah, we often say, collective impact works at the speed of trust. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that, business doesn't trust government or NGOs, NGOs don't trust business, et cetera. But even within each sector, NGOs don't trust each other, because they're competing for funding and they each have their own idea and vision. And it is part of what happens in the first year or two of a collective impact effort. The most powerful thing that happens is really people getting to know each other and build trust. There's a project in Nashville working on education, Alignment Nashville. 175 nonprofits working on education in Nashville. They've never gotten together before. I mean, again, I'm just constantly amazed at how many hundreds or thousands of organizations are working on any given issue in any community, and they've never even met each other, let alone begun to collaborate, let alone begun to work with business and with government and with churches and so on. And so that building of trust and building relationship is just tremendously powerful.
It's the currency of the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd say, the unique role that, I know less than everybody else here, but it seems like the unique role that data plays in trust building, where you can put the data at the center on the table. And that's the thing people come back to. Like when you're writing a book, you have a narrative arc. When you're lost, you come back to the narrative arc. When you're doing social work, when you come back to the data. And the other thing, how tricky, like we all say diversity is so hard. I don't think we appreciate how hard diversity is. Like even in the work we've done at Weave, there's all sorts of racial inequities that we have to deal with and listen to. And then there's even things I don't even think about, like I live in Washington, I'm used to a certain pace of life. We go to other places, they're not used to the same pace.
That's right.
And so you have to find the common pace you can work at. Absolutely. And that turns out that would never have occurred to me before doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
And I think even with data, and Monique, you could speak to this, and I'm going to ask another question, and then I think I'm to go to Q&A. But even with data, there are trust issues there as well. We found in our own network, in certain communities, data has been the enemy.
That's right.
So creating trust around data and also thinking about the kind of data that you include so that you have a fulsome picture is important.
Well, so yeah, there are a couple things I want to say about data that actually get back to the framework. So I do think, when we talk about mutually reinforcing activities and we talk about continuous improvement, the role that data plays, particularly with that backbone organization that is fundamentally working to build trust among all of these different sector and system partners. What we've seen across our network is it's the disaggregation of data and having the data tell the story about what the priorities of the work should be. That's one of the most critical ways to be able to not just bring the community together, but that community-based convener that person with the backbone, that person leading the backbone that has those historical relationships that have been the ones doing all of the community organizing, all of the community outreach, they're able to bring key partners together using that disaggregated data while they're also doing that relationship building over time, so that, to Mark's point, we see progress move at the speed of trust, and that backbone role is so critical to helping to bring those pieces together to tell a story. Because what's really important also about the data, it doesn't just guide strategy, it's also really key to narrative change. It's really important that the data helps you figure out strategy, it helps you bring partners across different systems and sectors together, but the data helps you understand that, again, actually, to what David said, we're program rich, but we're system poor. So we can, when we're working on social issues, we can begin to tell a very different story about the role that system plays in driving inequity versus the individuals who sometimes are blamed or held responsible for not being able to access opportunity. So across our network, the data has been key, and having that trusted backbone partner convene the collaborative to be able to help build trust and move the agenda is key, but also that communication strategy that has embedded a narrative change agenda so that they are able to begin to tell a different story and really build an arc around that that's tied to their strategy has also been really important to moving progress on the ground in place.
Just make one quick point. One of the things I like about most of the social organizations I really like, they have the language of systems and engineering so they can seem respectable to donors. We are emotionally avoidant. We don't want to talk about gushy stuff like love and all that kind of stuff. So they have the language of systems, which sounds serious. Economists can respect you. But it's actually all about love and friendship. And so they have an engineering frame for building love and friendship.
And I would say love, friendship, and data,
Yeah,
just to
yeah.
add that element. And, you know,
Your love relationships are different than mine.
it's a problem.
It makes for a great T-shirt, though.
No, part of the challenge with data is every organization measures their progress in their own way. Right? We looked at one effort in Calgary, Canada, homelessness initiative, and they started out by asking university to gather what data is being collected about the homeless in Calgary. And they looked at everything, you know, universities, hospitals, government agencies, police departments. There were 10,000 different data points being collected about the homeless in Calgary. There weren't 10,000 homeless people. And they got together and they said, what do we need to know if we're going to really make progress? And they said, okay, there are 8 things we need to track.
Yeah.
And we're all going to track the same 8 things. And then we can tell what's working. We can tell if we're making progress or where we need to change. And that is so powerful.
There's one thing I wanted to add, though, about the sort of the characteristics, right? The love, the trust, the relationships, but also I think empathy plays a role in this.
Sure.
And when we look at the leaders that we work with, the community organizers in place, the way that they're able to build relationships across systems and across sector is really, I think, that deep empathy that they bring to the work and the way that they're able to translate that in ways that are transformative for leaders across different sectors and systems. So I would just add that into the characteristics that are critical to driving these relationships.
Yeah, and I love that love and empathy and data, but love and empathy are hopefully making a comeback. I mean, when you think about the power of love, and again, people react to it, it's like, oh, that's soft, that's gushy. But when you really think about how transformative and how powerful, I think about James Baldwin. You know, for they are all our children, we will profit for or pay for what they become. If we treated every child like they were our child, we'd act quite differently. But here's my last question before going to Q&A. When you're a hammer, often everything looks like a nail. And for a while, I mean, the article took off and went viral, and everybody was using collective impact language. Everywhere I went, people were like, oh, we're doing collective impact. And I'm like, no, you're not. That's nice. But here's the question. When is collective impact not the route to take? Are there instances where you think the collective impact structure, the elements that we've talked about, that isn't appropriate for this particular challenge?
Well, you know, I've been astonished at how many different places in the world and how many different social issues it does work for. I think we found that the ability of communities to collaborate varies quite widely. And it's easier to do this in some parts of the country or parts of the world than others. And as I say, it doesn't always work. But I'm not, in my own experience, I mean, this sounds terrible to say, but I don't know of an issue that would not benefit and advance better because of a cross-sector collective impact effort.
And I would say, I guess I think about it more of a sequencing, right? Because our work in places to support infrastructure and capacity. And in order to really, I think, implement a collective impact model with the fidelity that the approach requires, you need deep infrastructure and capacity. So I would say we may be able to support some communities to collaborate, and over time they're deepening that infrastructure capacity, the institutional relationships that we've been talking about, the philanthropic investment, the advocacy agenda. And so then they may over time have the systems in place to track the data, the political will, they have that strong backbone partner, for example. So I would say across our network, at least, or sort of thinking nationally to answer your question, I would say sometimes I think it's also sequencing. Communities really need deep infrastructure and capacity to be able to implement that model with the fidelity that it requires based on the complexity of the work.
The only thing I'd say, this is really a question for Melody. So a lot of the time, I spend my life thinking on, let's call the Raj Chetty level of social change, which is community, neighborhood by neighborhood. But then the other half of my life is covering national politics. And there's going to be a debate tonight. There are going to be proposals that are national proposals. And I never quite know how to put those two things together. Like, how does national systemic change affect community change? Which is more important? Should we think about them together? I mean, you were in the White House. You must have thought about this.
Yes, and at the same time that I mentioned the Council for Community Solutions and their focus on opportunity youth because they wanted a specific issue to tackle while they thought about this approach more generally. There were two things that we did, going to your question. One was to establish Aspen as a home to do this work outside of government, but simultaneously to start to seed things and proposals in government to support this framework generally. So I'll just mention a couple before we go to Q&A. One, thinking about how federal funds flow. You know, are you blending funds? Are you braiding funds? Are you making it easier for organizations on the ground to do this kind of work? There is also specific work done with performance pilot projects for opportunity youth using this strategy and this model. So you can absolutely support community-based work on a national level. And in fact, I think it's critical. How do you get rid of hurdles? How do you create the right incentives so that it can grow and it can flourish? So I want to open the floor. Oh, great. To you all. Why don't I do this? I'm going to start in the very, very back, and we'll work our way forward. And maybe what I'll do, I'll take 3 questions, and we'll try to answer that at group, and then we'll do as many as we can before we have to end.
Thanks so much. Mark, you talked about collaboration moving at the speed of trust. And Monique, you talked about, in your own work, seeing a backbone organization. I'll just refer for a second, Ray Dalio's work in malaria is well known and is a collective impact sort of template. And I've heard the term trusted broker, right? Like someone who doesn't have a dog in the race, who's the convener. So my question is, do you think that you need that person or organization to help collective impact sort of crystallize, or are there other ways that you've seen that happen in your work?
Okay, great. That's one. And we'll take a question right here from Wendy. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to cram 2 questions together. One is, I think it's interesting to see where our research dollars are going. It feels like they are most often looking at the success of discrete interventions versus at the question of what is actually happening in neighborhoods or in communities that are making the fastest progress. And I wonder if you're seeing any movement on that. I mean, I think Raj's work has lots of potential, but even talking with him, it just feels like that's a huge area that would be very illuminating. I'm just curious what you're seeing on that. And then secondly, and maybe this picks up on the first question, I guess we've all also seen collective impact efforts that don't affect the kind of progress as you've mentioned. And we've probably also seen efforts that have organically grown from trust and relationships and people's exercising the kind of muscle to hold the space, to bring people together, to think together, that may not have a formal backbone organization, but actually may have more success in bringing the grassroots together with the grass tops. And I struggle a bit with this idea that there's a thing that we need to do. Now, like, there's a backbone and it's gonna look exactly like this. And I just wonder where you are in your thinking around, like, the extent to which we need to be growing this kind of collective impact in organic ways within communities versus, creating a new thing that's like the collective impact backbone, like where you are on that spectrum of things.
Got it, great. And I'll take a question from the gentleman here, the purple.
Sort of like to piggyback on what you're talking about, and somewhat related to the work I do, and you're talking about backbone, capacity building, infrastructure. And there's I'm not sure how new it is, but there's something called new power nowadays. And I'm struggling in my own work between that question and the question you raised of, who are we, the creators of the backbone, the creators of the entity and infrastructure, to try to take charge and lead and create the collective impact. And there is a natural tension that I've discovered. I think David has in the work he's doing even. And so how do you reconcile that? And does this new power theory really change at all or alter the collective impact theory, and do they go together in some manner?
Great, okay, we'll take those three and then we'll come back and do another round. So we had a question about trusted broker. How critical is it necessary to crystallize the work? Where research funds are going, my pen started running out so I can barely read my writing. Where research funds are going, discrete interventions versus in the neighborhood, thank you. And whether or not we have to create something whole cloth and new, or have it organically emerge, kind of mixed with this new power idea.
Well, let me just respond very quickly to those. I think the idea of this trusted third party, this trusted person who doesn't have a dog in the race is essential because you're bringing together people with very different power structures, very different levels of power and so on, and there does need to be this trusted person. In terms of research and development and the way we evaluate things, I think so much of the way we evaluate things is based on this model of isolated impact, that there's going to be a single organization with a single magic bullet that solves some complex problem, and we just need to measure and prove it. And that's not how we see change happening through collective impact. I also think there are many organic movements that are evolving. We try to be careful to say we sort of codified and named collective impact. We didn't invent it, and there were many people in communities already doing this work. I think we've enabled them to learn from each other because there's now a name for it, and so they can see who else is doing it. And things like this forum of 1,000 people who met this year is very powerful in helping people learn from this work, but a lot of it is organic. It isn't a formula you just apply. It really does have to be adapted in each community in its own way. And in terms of the backbone, taking charge and so on, there's something that people are now writing about called system leadership, which is a way of leading change without imposing an agenda. And it's very much about gathering others and empowering others. And I think it's consistent with a lot of the social media new power engagement of people. And that's the kind of leadership that collective impact takes. You need someone strong enough to make sure things happen, but not someone who has an answer, who's imposing his or her own agenda. You've got to be bringing those answers out of people. And it's often just very common sense changes that we see collective impact efforts make that are so powerful. Very simple things that enable people to learn from each other. Do the kindergarten teachers communicate with the preschool teachers about what kindergarten readiness is so that they know?
The only thing I would add to tie to our earlier conversation is that when Mark walked through the framework, he said what was missing was equity and community engagement. If you truly are committed to this approach, then the trusted broker, the organic way that the solution comes up in your organizing local partners, all of that is at its core around equity and community engagement, and that's how the work is co-owned and sustained over the long term.
Yeah, the only thing, I have a friend who talks about she practices aggressive friendship. And in the balance between organic and intentional, I'm very pro-intentional, like doing artificial things to make your friendships happen. And then the second thing on New Power, we just did this Weave conference in DC, and we did it in the round because we wanted everybody to be equal, but we had an 18-inch stage in the middle, and everyone hated the stage because it put some people above others. And so we're in a world where people are extremely sensitive to power inequalities. And how you lead without imposing, it's a super big challenge, and I think we should be reasonably pessimistic that it can work. I mean, we have terrible followers.
Okay, I'm going to do two more quick ones. This gentleman, who's been waving at me, I'll take his question, and then the woman right here as well. Yes, and please, if you, because I'm about to get the hook, so we'll go directly to
Lives
question.
in Washington, D.C. How many members of Congress have read this article and are aware of it? Because doesn't the Founding Fathers talk about collective impact, and somehow we've gone awry?
Civic virtue. Question here?
What do you think?
Oh, hold on one second, because we're recording, so.
I was in a hurry.
Yes, thank you.
Good morning. What do you think the power of an event? I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've had riots based on police shootings. We've had that. Just recently, we had a school shooting. You know, and then we were 50th in the nation in the Cherry Report. The Cherry Report in Charlotte is like the Bible. Cherry. And so we've had those three things that have, you know, bad thing, some more than others. And using this as a catalyst, it mobilized the community to work collectively. But then it's the bad thing that gets us together. I think that's what happened in Charleston. Same thing. You know, when that happened, when the church shooting happened in Charleston. And what is the strength of this kind of event that surfaces all of the problems that we've been having, and the strength of the community to carry those forward? And if you have not had that happen in your community, just set the watch, because it will happen.
Great questions. So, members of Congress, are they woke on collective impact?
I would say
And
they're
also-
drowsy, not fully woke, but not completely asleep.
And negative events, challenging events as a catalyst for surfacing the challenges and bringing people together.
Well, you talk about sort of the readiness for collective impact, and one of those is having a funder who will support it. One of those is having a leader who really has clout and authority and is trusted in the community. And one of those is the urgency for change. And so the kinds of events you're talking about certainly create an urgency for change. The only thing I'd add is that when we did this, had this evaluation done of collective impact efforts, the average age of collective impact efforts that were showing real progress was 12 years. So it's not a quick approach.
That's right.
And so I think sometimes the urgent event leads to a sense that we need an answer right away. And collective impact is powerful, but takes time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you. I know there are so many more questions to take. Obviously, people will be around. We love to continue to engage, but please help me thank the panelists.